History is rarely shaped by the roar of the crowd or the decree of kings, but rather by the silent and terrifying precision of a single mind that sees the world not as it is, but as a geometry to be conquered. Before the crown of gold and the rivers of blood, there was only a boy, a chalkboard, and the absolute cold truth of numbers. The winter of 1779 descended upon the military academy of Brienne-le-Château like a leaden shroud, encasing the ancient stone walls in a frost that seemed to penetrate the very bones of the students within. Among the rows of privileged French nobility, there stood a 10-year-old boy from Corsica who was distinctly apart, an island unto himself in a sea of hostile aristocracy. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he possessed a heavy Italian accent that invited the cruel mockery of his peers, who ridiculed his provincial origins and his strange intensity. While the other cadets spent their leisure hours in frivolous games or boasting of their lineage, the young Corsican retreated into the only fortress that would never betray him, which was the library. In the dusty silence of that sanctuary, he discovered that mathematics was not merely a subject to be learned, but a divine language that governed the case of the universe. He devoured the works of Euclid and the complex theorems of algebra with a hunger that bordered on starvation, finding in the rigid logic of equations a comfort that human interaction denied him. For a boy who felt the sting of rejection daily, the predictability of numbers offered a profound solace, as a mathematical proof does not judge one's accent or poverty, but yields only to the power of intellect. His instructors began to notice that when he stood before a blackboard, his posture shifted from defensive to commanding, his gray-blue eyes narrowing as he dismantled complex problems with the speed of a striking hawk. It was during these formative years of isolation that the seed of his future genius was planted, rooting itself deep in the fertile soil of his resentment and his ambition. He began to see the physical world through the lens of geometry, visualizing the arc of a thrown stone, not as a playful motion, but as a parabolic curve defined by velocity and gravity. The courtyard fights of the academy became studies in force and leverage, and the snowy fields of Brienne transformed in his mind into vast grids where positioning was the variable that determined survival. He wrote letters home to his mother, Letizia Ramolino, but they were sparse and stoic, hiding the turmoil of a soul that was slowly hardening into diamond under the immense pressure of his environment. The young cadet realized that while he could not match the wealth of his classmates, he could dominate them through the sheer force of calculation, using his mind as a weapon that no amount of gold could parry. As the years at Brienne drew to a close, his instructors wrote in his final report that he was a master of mathematics who would make an excellent sailor. Yet destiny had a far more volatile path in mind for him. He was not meant for the fluid uncertainty of the sea, but for the thunderous physics of the land, where the abstraction of angles would soon manifest as the trajectory of cannonballs. The solitary axiom of his youth was complete, proving that in a world of chaos, the man who calculates the fastest is the one who holds the power of life and death. The theoretical silence of the library was shattered forever by the chaotic roar of the French Revolution, which swept away the old order and plunged the nation into a bloody anarchy that demanded not scholars, but executioners. By the autumn of 1793, the young officer found himself standing on the jagged hills overlooking the port of Toulon, where a royalist rebellion backed by the British fleet threatened to strangle the fragile republic in its cradle. To the veteran commanders surrounding him, the siege was a confused mess of mud and despair. But to Captain Bonaparte, the battlefield was simply another equation waiting to be balanced. He looked down at the harbor and did not see ships or forts, but rather lines of sight and trajectories, realizing instantly that the capture of a single geographic point, the fort of Les Guillettes, would render the entire British position mathematically untenable. He worked with a feverish intensity that terrified his subordinates, sleeping beside his cannons in the freezing rain and calculating firing angles with a precision that bordered on obsession. The artillery was no longer a crude instrument of noise, but a sniper's rifle in the hands of a giant, as he adjusted elevation and charge to drop heated shot onto the wooden decks of the enemy fleet with devastating accuracy. When the final assault began in the pitch black of night, Bonaparte led the charge himself, receiving a bayonet wound to the thigh that he barely acknowledged, for his mind was entirely consumed by the geometry of victory. The fall of Toulon was his first proof of concept, a demonstration that the rigid laws of ballistics could impose order upon the case of human conflict, and it catapulted the 24-year-old artilleryman to the rank of brigadier general. However, the true test of his cold calculus arrived not on the frontier, but in the heart of Paris in October of 1795 during the crisis of 13 Vendémiaire. A royalist mob of 30,000 angry citizens marched on the National Convention, threatening to overthrow the government, and the defense was placed in the hands of the disgraced General Bonaparte. Unlike other commanders who might have hesitated to fire upon their own countrymen, Napoleon viewed the approaching crowd as a fluid, dynamic problem, a mass of biological matter moving through the narrow corridors of the city streets. He positioned his cannons at key intersections near the Church of St. Roch, loading them not with solid round shot, but with canister, tin cases filled with musket balls designed to turn a cannon into a massive shotgun. As the mob surged forward, fueled by righteous anger and adrenaline, Napoleon waited until they were within point-blank range, his face a mask of terrifying neutrality. He gave the order to fire, and the whiff of grapeshot tore through the densely packed streets, shredding the rebellion in a single thunderous instant of calculated violence. The cobblestones were slick with blood and the air thick with the metallic taste of gunpowder, yet the general felt no remorse. Only the satisfaction of a solved equation where the variable of chaos had been eliminated. He had saved the Republic, but in doing so he had revealed to the world, and perhaps to himself, that he possessed the will to treat human lives as mere numbers in the grand arithmetic of power. The angle of his ascent was now vertical, driven by the explosive force of artillery and an intellect that had severed its emotional connection to the suffering it caused. The coronation in December of 1804 was not merely a ceremony of pomp and velvet, but the final derivation of a formula that transformed a provincial soldier into the master of Europe. Beneath the vaulted ceiling of Notre Dame, amidst the smoke of frankincense and the glitter of gold, Napoleon took the crown from the hands of the Pope and placed it upon his own head, an act that symbolized that his authority was not a divine gift, but a calculated result of his own will. Beside him knelt Josephine, the woman who served as the essential constant in his chaotic life, providing the emotional ballast that kept his hyper-rational mind from spiraling into total abstraction. She was the one variable he could not quantify, yet her presence softened the rigid edges of his ambition, allowing the mathematician to remain, for a brief moment, a man. However, the true manifestation of his imperial equation would not be found in the safety of Paris, but in the freezing mists of Moravia 1 year later, on the morning of December 2nd, 1805. The Battle of Austerlitz was the supreme masterpiece of his career, a conflict where the battlefield was treated exactly like a chalkboard in the lecture halls of Brienne. Facing the combined might of the Russians and Austrian empires, Napoleon did not rely on brute force, but engineered a psychological and geometric trap of terrifying sophistication. He deliberately weakened his right flank, offering a tempting numerical advantage to his enemies, a calculated variable designed to lure them away from the high ground of the Pratzen Heights. It was a gamble that defied conventional military logic, relying entirely on his ability to predict the movement of 80,000 men as if they were planets following a gravitational law he alone understood. As the sun rose to pierce the heavy fog, known ever after as the Sun of Austerlitz, the trap snapped shut with the precision of a steel mechanism. The French marshals, moving like variables in a complex function, dished into the gap left by the enemy, severing the Allied army in two and turning their numerical superiority into a chaotic mass of panic. Napoleon watched from his command post, his telescope trained on the unfolding disaster not with the excitement of a warrior, but with the cold satisfaction of a scientist witnessing a successful experiment. The climax of this cruel geometry occurred on the frozen Satchon ponds, where fleeing Russian troops crowded onto the ice, seeking escape from the relentless French advance. With a nod that was almost imperceptible, the emperor ordered his artillery to lower their elevation, not to target the men, but to strike the ice itself. The heavy cannonballs smashed into the frozen surface, shattering the floor beneath the panicked soldiers and plunging thousands into the freezing black water. The screams of the dying and the cracking of the ice were horrific auditory variables in his equation. Yet to Napoleon, they were the necessary remainders of a solved problem. By evening, the Third Coalition was shattered, and the map of Europe was being redrawn by the nib of his quill. He had achieved the impossible, balancing the imperial equation through a perfect synthesis of artillery, psychology, and geography, proving that on this day, he was not just a king of men, but the absolute monarch of time and space. The geometric perfection that had defined the emperor's rise began to fray not on the battlefield, but within the velvet silence of the Tuileries Palace, where Napoleon made the coldest calculation of his life. By 1809, he had determined that the stability of his empire required a biological heir, a variable that his beloved Josephine could no longer provide. With the heavy heart of a man amputating a limb to save the body, he divorced her, severing the emotional anchor that had grounded his restless spirit and replacing her with the Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria. This was a dynastic equation solved on paper, yet in reality it introduced a subtle error into his psyche. For without Josephine, the intuitive genius that complemented his rigid logic began to wither, leaving only a hubris that recognized no boundaries. This divergent line of thinking led him to the catastrophic decision of June 1812, when he amassed the Grande Armée to invade Russia. It was a force of over 600,000 men, a staggering number that defied the logistical theorems of the era, moving like a slow, suffocating blanket across the map. For the first time, the scale of the operation exceeded the capacity of his mind to micromanage every variable. And the Russian strategy of scorched earth introduced a factor of nothingness that his mathematics could not process. He sought a decisive battle, a grand geometric collision like Austerlitz, but the Russians simply retreated into the infinite horizon, stretching his supply lines until they were as thin and brittle as a spider's web. The heat of the summer killed men by the thousands before a single shot was fired, proving that the environment itself was an enemy that could not be outflanked. When the collision finally occurred at Borodino, it was not a masterpiece of tactics but a crude, bloody bludgeoning, where artillery was used not for precision but for mass slaughter. Napoleon sat lethargic and ill, staring at the smoke with a dull gaze, unable to summon the brilliant maneuvers of his youth because the sheer density of the combat allowed for no elegant angles. He marched into Moscow expecting a surrender, the logical conclusion to a captured capital, but found instead a hollow city that was soon engulfed in flames. The burning of Moscow was an irrational act that defied his European calculus, leaving him stranded in the charred ruins of his own ambition. Then came the retreat, a descent into a white hell where the temperature dropped to variables he had never accounted for in his strategic planning. The winter did not fight with cannons, but with a silence that froze blood in the veins and turned the proudest army in history into a ragged column of ghosts. The road back was paved with the frozen corpses of soldiers who had once marched to the drumbeat of glory, now reduced to stiffened markers in the snow. The emperor rode in a carriage wrapped in furs, his mind racing to find a solution. But for the first time, the equation yielded no answer. The Grande Armée had not been defeated by a superior intellect, but by the sheer, unquantifiable vastness of nature, proving that there are dimensions to the world that no amount of mathematical genius can ever truly conquer. The final theorem of Napoleon's life was attempted on the 18th of June, 1815, on the rain-soaked fields of Waterloo. He returned from his first exile with a desperate energy, seeking to reassert the logic of his rule against a Europe that had united to erase him. However, the battlefield itself conspired against his mathematical precision, for the heavy rains of the previous night had turned the ground into a deep, clinging mud. This was a critical variable that destroyed his primary advantage, as artillery relies on the hard earth for the ricochet effect that extends the lethal range of a cannonball. Instead of skipping through the enemy lines like stones on a pond, his shots plunged harmlessly into the sludge, their kinetic energy absorbed by the wet soil. Napoleon waited for the ground to dry, a fatal delay that allowed the Prussian army to arrive and alter the numerical balance of the engagement. Across the valley stood the Duke of Wellington, a man who did not fight with geometric rigidity, but with a pragmatic adaptability that baffled the emperor. Napoleon launched his columns in massive, predictable formations, trying to crush the British line with pure weight, but Wellington had hidden his men behind the reverse slope of the ridge, shielding them from the French eyes and fire. It was a battle of two minds, the calculator versus the improviser. As the day wore on and the Prussians arrived to flank him, the emperor's equation collapsed into a chaotic remainder of zero. The old guard, the elite constants of his army who had never known defeat, finally broke, and with them, the illusion that the world could be ordered by the will of a single man shattered forever. The aftermath was not death, but a fate far more terrifying for a man of infinite energy, absolute silence. He was exiled to St. Helena, a desolate volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, a geometric point so isolated that it barely existed on the maps of the era. Here, the master of artillery was stripped of his cannons, his maps, and his armies, left with nothing but the relentless sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs. The house he inhabited, Longwood, was damp and infested with rats, a cruel prison for the man who had once slept in the palaces of Vienna and Berlin. Yet, even in this void, his mind continued to work, no longer calculating trajectories for the future, but recalculating the past. He spent his final years dictating his memoirs, obsessively revisiting his battles, trying to find the specific variable where the math had gone wrong. He spoke of what if and if only, attempting to solve the equation of his life one last time, to prove that his genius was flawless and that it was only destiny that had erred. But the silence of the ocean offered no validation, and the damp air slowly ate away at his health. On the 5th of May, 1821, as a violent storm raged outside, tearing up trees and whipping the sea into a fury, the emperor whispered his final words. He died not as a conqueror, but as a prisoner of the very geography he had tried to master, leaving behind a legacy that proved that while a man can calculate the arc of a shell, he can never fully measure the depth of the human soul. The emperor sleeps, but the echoes of his cannons still resonate in the architecture of our modern world. He taught us that destiny is not a star to be wished upon, but a structure to be built, stone by stone, number by number. Yet, his fall reminds us that there is always a remainder, a chaotic element that refuses to be tamed by logic. If you wish to continue exploring the giants who calculated the weight of the world and found it wanting, subscribe to our channel. Join us as we decipher the equations of history, one legend at a time.